Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a massive historical mystery. We're going to break down the cold, precise calculations that actually spared Japan's capital from a nuclear strike at the end of World War II. It's a crazy intersection of military strategy, unpredictable weather, and a totally horrific bombing campaign that had already happened. So let's start right at the heart of the matter with a question that seems totally obvious, but honestly rarely gets asked. Why wasn't Tokyo bombed? It was the absolute center of the Japanese empire. It seems like the most logical target if you want a decapitating strike to end the war, right? But it was completely omitted from the final atomic target list. Let's untangle exactly why that happened. Before we get into the strategic math, we really need to anchor ourselves in the sheer human cost here. We're talking about an estimated 130,000 people who died in the initial atomic blasts at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction was just unprecedented, and grasping the true magnitude of that is absolutely crucial to understanding the grim logic that kept Tokyo off the list. Let's rewind a bit to July 1945. Following the successful Trinity test, President Harry Truman knew he had his hands on what he called the most terrible weapon in history. The situation was incredibly dire. Conventional bombing just wasn't raking the Japanese resolve, and a brutal ground invasion was looming. He had to figure out how to deploy this new, terrifying technology to definitively end the war in the Pacific. Now, this decision obviously didn't happen in a vacuum. Truman and his military advisors mapped out 4 distinct paths to force a surrender. They could just keep up the conventional bombing, they could launch a full-scale land invasion, they could do a harmless demonstration on an uninhabited island, or they could drop the atomic bomb on the city. They threw out the island demonstration pretty quickly. Why? Well, there was a massive risk the bomb might be a dud. And remember, they literally only had 2 of them left in the entire arsenal. So it really came down to a full ground invasion versus a nuclear strike, and the military leaders faced a horrifying reality. They were looking at astronomical casualty rates on both sides. From recovered documents, they knew Japanese forces were planning to have every single soldier, civilian, and child fight to the bitter end. The grim logic was that immediate, overwhelming destruction from a nuclear strike might literally be the only way to break that absolute resolve. President Truman summed up the dread surrounding a ground assault pretty perfectly. You have to remember the recent Battle of Okinawa. That battle saw a staggering 35% casualty rate. 1 out of every 3 soldiers engaged was killed or wounded. Truman rightfully feared that a mainland invasion would be an absolute bloodbath. As he put it, it would be Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other. Okay, so having decided on the nuclear option, an advisory board drew up a strict shortlist of candidate cities. They had 2 rigid criteria. First, the city needed military factories. Second, and this is key, it had to be largely untouched by conventional bombs. They needed a pristine target so the U.S. could clearly measure and demonstrate the terrifying, singular power of this new weapon. The initial candidates? Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Kyoto. But that target list was actually incredibly fluid. Take Kyoto, for example. It's an ancient capital, had a population of about 1 million people, and was originally the secondary target. But Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson had actually vacationed there before the war. He knew its immense cultural significance, so he personally intervened. He relentlessly pressured military leadership to spare the city, and because he did, Nagasaki was hastily thrown onto the list as a replacement. And that seemingly minor bureaucratic swap, it sealed Nagasaki's fate. On August 6th, Hiroshima was destroyed. 3 days later, the bomber Bockscar flew toward its primary target, which was Kokura. But when they got there, Kokura was completely hidden by thick clouds. Running incredibly low on fuel, the crew had to make a split-second decision. They abandoned Kokura and rerouted to their alternate target, dropping the bomb on Nagasaki at exactly 11:02 a.m. Right, but what about the capital? Throughout all these intense committee meetings, all the geographic calculations, the last-minute city swaps, Tokyo was never even put on the list of potential atomic targets. Not a single time. Which brings us right back to our main mystery. Why was the very heart of the Japanese empire totally ignored by the architects of the atomic age? No, planners did briefly debate it. Their main worry was that if they vaporized the capital without warning, they'd instantly kill the entire Japanese leadership. Now sure, that might sound like a military victory, but the U.S. desperately needed a functioning government left alive to actually negotiate and sign a surrender document. Obliterating the chain of command could actually prolong the war. But honestly, while that was a factor, the primary reason Tokyo was ignored is much, much darker. The stark, chilling reality is that Tokyo simply didn't meet the criteria of being an untouched city. Why? Because there was literally nothing left to bomb. By August 1945, the vast capital city of the Japanese Empire was already just charred piles of wood and ash. To grasp the true scale of what happened, we need to jump back 5 months before the Enola Gay ever flew over Hiroshima. The U.S. executed something called Operation Meeting House. This was a massive, ultra-aggressive night raid on March 9th and 10th, 1945. It was specifically designed to ignite the densely packed, highly flammable wooden infrastructure of Tokyo using thousands of incendiary weapons. The tactics here were just terrifyingly calculated. Under General Curtis LeMay, they totally abandoned standard high-altitude bombing. Instead, LeMay ordered a fleet of 334 B-29 bombers to drop down to an incredibly low altitude, just 7,000 feet. To max out their payload and speed, they stripped the bombers of all defensive guns. These defenseless planes flew single file through the dark, blanketing the city with over 1,600 tons of napalm. The footprint of the destruction was just unimaginable. 15 square miles of Tokyo were completely swallowed by an apocalyptic firestorm over 4 days. The heat was so incredibly intense that canals literally boiled. Metal frames melted into puddles. Over 1 million people were left entirely homeless in just a matter of hours. And the human toll? Staggering. The mortality rate from Operation Meeting House was catastrophic. More than 100,000 civilians were killed in the blaze, and countless others suffered permanent disfigurement from third-degree burns. This single event cemented Operation Meeting House as the deadliest airstrike of the entire war. It actually surpassed the initial death tolls of either atomic bomb. To really put the sheer scale of this horror into perspective, think about the infamous firebombing of Dresden in Germany. That was a horrific tragedy that resulted in 25,000 deaths. Yet, that number is just a fraction of the absolute devastation unleashed on Tokyo in a single night. So yes, the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet Union suddenly declaring war, did ultimately provide the massive shock value needed to force an unconditional surrender. But we have to understand they were simply the finale. They were the brutal conclusion to a conventional bombing campaign that had already caused around 330,000 civilian deaths and pretty much decimated Japan's major cities. Which leaves us with a really provocative question to ponder. Tokyo wasn't spared from destruction, it was just subjected to a different kind of apocalypse. When a city is already erased by conventional fire, does an atomic bomb really change the reality of destruction? Or does it just change the efficiency of the method? It's a heavy thought,